roles. In this nugget, I'll be talking to you about operations master roles. Now, in a previous nugget, I mentioned that all domain controllers are peer domain controllers and all domain controllers are created equal. Well, in reality, some domain controllers are more equal than others. You see, there's several roles called operations master roles where they have a special purpose in the domain or in the forest. There are 2 forest operations masters, and there are 3 domain operation masters in each domain. And only one domain controller can have any one of these specific roles. And we'll take a look at what those roles are and what they're used for. And we'll also take a look at where to place those roles. I mean, you could put the whole glob of roles on one domain controller, but that might not be advisable in many situations. So I'll give you some advice on where to place them. And that's going to be especially important when we talk about the infrastructure master role, especially in relation to global catalogs. We'll also talk about how to transfer those roles. What if I've got them all on one server and I realize that's not good for our situation, so I want to transfer some of them to a different domain controller? Well, a transfer is a cooperative effort where I'll take its original domain controller and I'll synchronize it or cooperate with another domain controller and we'll agreeably transfer that role over. On the other hand, maybe my domain controller that has that role has gone down hard. It's blown up, it's smoking, flames are shooting out the back of it or something like that. And that server may never ever come back. Well, if that's the case, I may need to seize that role instead, and I'll show you how to do that without the cooperation of the original because it's in flames. Now, in the past, we've talked about domain controllers and how they're all peer domain controllers. No one domain controller is somehow superior to the others in the sense that we used to have in NT4, where you'd have PDCs and BDCs. However, there are certain roles on Windows Server 2003 and Windows 2000, domain controllers, that are special in the entire forest or in the entire domain. And those operations roles are called operations master roles. And in the past, in Windows 2000, we just called them flexible single master operations roles, or fsmos for short, and that's what I still call them. I still call it the fsmo. Well, we have 5 specific roles that are assigned to one or more domain controllers for these fsmo roles. In the forest, we have 2 roles. One is the schema fsmo. And see, anytime you actually edit the schema, remember we edited the schema not too long ago, when I made an edit change to the schema, I was actually doing that on a specific domain controller, the schema master operation role. So in fact, if I'm in Phoenix and the schema fsmo is in Bangladesh somewhere, then when I make an edit change to the schema, it might look like I'm doing it in Phoenix. In reality, I'm making that change across a WAN link to that schema fsmo in Bangladesh, because only one server can have that schema fsmo role. So we have that role for the forest, because remember, the schema applies to the entire forest. We also have the domain naming fsmo role. And this simply helps to make sure that when I create a new domain of any kind in this same forest, then I'm not accidentally duplicating the name of another domain. So for example, if I'm in nuggetlab.com, and that's my first domain, and I create child.nuggetlab.com, then I don't want another administrator on the other side of the globe somewhere to think that he needs to create a child domain as well, and just name his domain also child.nuggetlab.com. You see, we could potentially have 2 administrators naming the domains the same name, and that would cause just a catastrophic issue in terms of your directory database. So with this domain naming fsmo role, when you create another domain, it checks against the domain naming fsmo, and it says, hey, do we already have a domain of this name? And if it does, it'll kick it out and say that, well, you can't do that because you've already got one by that name. So those are the 2 fsmo roles for the forest. Now, as for the domain, we have some other roles going on here. First one is the PDC emulator. No matter how many domains I have in the forest, each domain in that forest will have these 3 roles somewhere on some domain controller. Well, let's start with the PDC emulator. Now, that's just the way it sounds. That's for down-level NTLAN manager replication to, for example, NT4 BDCs. If you still have any NT4 domain controllers, then those NT4 domain controllers will be tricked into thinking that whoever has the PDC emulator fsmo role is the actual NT4 PDC that those NT4 backup domain controllers are used to seeing. Likewise, if you have any down-level clients, again, that means older clients such as NT4, that make password changes. Well, they make password changes only on the PDC emulator. That's really the PDC emulator, not the PDC. I guess I had to put a little E there. It's called the PDC emulator. And even if you don't have any NT4 or any older legacy clients within your environment, any down-level clients, and you're all Windows XP and all Windows Server 2003, you still need and you still use the PDC emulator role. See, if I have a password change, maybe I've got a couple of domain controllers out here, and they're separated by even a WAN link, let's say. And I've got my PDC emulator here, and this is just a normal domain controller over here. Well, I got my user that's logged on here, and they decide to change their password. When this user changes their password, it changes it against the domain controller that they last logged on to. So it'll make the password change here, but the PDC emulator will receive password changes out of band. That means that it will receive preferential treatment in terms of the replication of password changes. So in other words, if we were supposed to wait 4 hours before we replicate any changes from this domain controller to this domain controller, now what will happen is when this user makes their password change on this domain controller, it's going to replicate that password change real soon, pretty quick in fact, to this PDC emulator role over here. Now what's the purpose for that? Well, let's say this user here goes to another location, to another branch office down here, and they log on to another domain controller. That's supposed to be a DC here. Another domain controller. Well, this domain controller may not have received the fact that this password has changed yet. So when this domain controller tries to log that user on, it says, hey, that's not the password I got for you, because this user has just changed their password. So what this domain controller will do then is it will automatically say, hey, if that's not the password I've got, I'm going to immediately go to the PDC emulator to check to see if there's been any recent changes to the password. And if there have been, then we're going to go ahead and forward the credentials to the PDC emulator to have that domain controller log this user on, because apparently I don't have the most up-to-date information. Now, another function of the PDC emulator is to be the authority within that domain for the time. You see, it's critical that your client computers and all your member servers and all the other domain controllers are pretty close to the same exact system time on those computers so that we don't have any problems with expired Kerberos tickets or Kerberos logons, which require 5 minutes skew or less between machines. And if there's more than 5 minutes difference between, for example, an XP workstation and a domain controller, then the domain controller cannot log that user on for Kerberos purposes. So the PDC emulator, what we'll normally do with that is we'll synchronize it with an external time source. And this PDC emulator will go through probably a firewall to an external time source out there on the internet, to an NTP server, a Network Time Protocol server, and it uses UDP port 123 in order to be able to do this. So make sure your firewall allows for that. Once the PDC emulator synchronizes its time, then all of the member servers and workstations will synchronize off of this PDC emulator, and also any other domain controllers that you have will also synchronize off the basis of this PDC emulator. And the net result of that is, within a given site, in an Active Directory site, whether it's Windows 2000 or Windows Server 2003, you should have no more than 20 seconds skew time between any workstation and server and the domain controllers. As far as between your sites are concerned, you should never have any more than 2 minutes skew between any two computers throughout your entire enterprise, no matter how large it is, as long as you're using your time synchronization like this. So the PDC emulator, in terms of the time, is a very important issue there. Also, the PDC emulator assumes the role of the domain master browser. And in the domain, that allows us to search for and locate other computers by name or by using things such as UNC paths to certain locations. Let's take a look at another role we have, and that's the RID master, or the relative ID master. To do that, let me go ahead and just show you a SID, first of all. If I do a little command called who am I, and then a /user, then this shows me that this particular user account, my trainer account, has a SID. That's a security identifier that uniquely identifies me within this domain. And that would be an S-1-5-21. That's the Microsoft standard convention. You'll always see that at the beginning of a SID. And there's unique numbers that identify the domain, and there should be no two domains that can have the same number there. And then we'll have a unique number at the end of this that identifies this user account within the domain. So if I created another user account, and this was the last account I had just created, then the next one would be all of these numbers followed by a -1108, and so on. So what the RID master does is it makes sure that I don't accidentally issue the same SID to 2 or more accounts, and it guarantees that functionality. Let's say here, for example, I've got a RID master, and it's also my PDC emulator, but I got a RID master on this server. What it does is it carves out a pool of numbers that it can use, and it will give itself a certain pool of numbers that it can use. Let's say, 1 through 100 here, and then it gives this other domain controller here, it'll issue it another pool of numbers, and I'll give it, 101 through, 200. And then if I had another domain controller to issue it another set of numbers, 201 through 300. And it's actually more numbers than that, but you get the idea. It does issue a pool of numbers for each one of these domain controllers. And then if this domain controller here uses up its numbers, or comes close to using up its numbers actually, then it will request a new pool from the RID master so that it can keep on numbering new SIDs. And by the way, you can see that using a specific tool called DC Diag, and then you do I'll just show you this as a free bonus. Just type DC Diag /test, and then we're going to look for RID Manager. Now, don't ask me why. Microsoft gives us a tool where we don't call it RID Master. We got to call it RID Manager. So anyway, we call it RID Manager, and then /V here to get verbose information. Oops, there we go. Verbose information. If I scroll back up here, we get information about that specific RID pool. The RID pool is 4,603 at this time to, like I said, it's over 1 billion, so we could create about at least 1 billion objects here. And then DC Nugget 1 is the RID master. It's bind with the RID master successfully. The RID allocation pool that we currently have out there is 3603 through 4102, which is exactly 500 if we go ahead and use the first number as well. The previous allocation pool that we used was this series of numbers, and the next RID that we use, in other words, the next object that I create, is going to have this specific RID number at the end of its SID. And then finally, the infrastructure master role, which I'll get into more detail a little bit later on because it can be complicated in terms of how you place it. The infrastructure master role makes sure that I have cross-domain references appropriately named. And I'll just leave it at that for now. We'll talk about that in more a little while. Now then, when you install your first domain controller in the domain, you're going to find that all of these fsmo roles are on the same domain controller. My first domain controller in nuggetlab.com has the schema, domain naming, PDC, infrastructure, and RID fsmo roles all on the same server, in addition to the fact that, recall, this will also be the global catalog in this environment. Now, if I've got a small environment and I don't even have budget maybe for an additional domain controller, that's just how I'm going to have to leave it. It's probably going to be for a very small office. I got 12 people in the office, or 20 people, or something like that. But of course, if you have budget, it always makes sense if you can install an additional domain controller. And that way you can help to split some things up here. Not only for redundancy, or for the fact that you might want to make sure that if you lose one server, that you don't lose all of these roles and all of the ability for anybody to log on, but that you at least have another domain controller here to continue to service log on if this one goes down for maintenance or unexpected purposes. And that's often what you're going to find if you go into something like, I'll just call it kind of a small environment here, where at least I've got a couple of domain controllers. And if this is the case, then what I'll do is I'll put the forest fsmos, the schema and domain naming fsmo roles, on one domain controller, and then the PDC, RID, and infrastructure roles on another domain controller over here. And that way, at least I've kind of got a logical line to divide up the forest side of things and the domain side of things, and I still have the ability to continue to function if one of these domain controllers fails. The other one can continue to provide normal logon service. Now, if one of these fails, by the way, you might not know it for a long time, or ever, in fact. For example, the domain naming role, that just keeps track of what goes on if I have additional domains. If I never add any more domains, or never remove any domains from the forest in a multi-domain environment, then the domain naming master role never really needs to be used for anything. Likewise, if I want to make any modifications to the schema, I would know at that point that I'll get error messages as soon as I try to modify the schema if this server here were down. But otherwise, if I never touch the schema for any modification purposes, again, I'll never even miss it, the fact that I don't have the schema fsmo role available. Now also you see here that I mentioned the global catalog, and I explicitly listed it here as well. And why is that? Well, that's relative to this domain naming role that we've got up here. Because you see, if I add another domain to the forest, the domain naming master needs to check to see if there are other domains by the same name that I'm trying to create. And what it does is it checks the name that I'm proposing against the global catalog to see if that domain already exists. So that's why we need to have the domain naming master and the global catalog on the same server. Now let me also point out that this issue where I've got to couple the domain naming master with the global catalog on the same server is only an issue if I'm running a forest set to the Windows 2000 functional level. If my forest functional level is Windows Server 2003, then I no longer have to couple those two together. Now on the other hand, if this server here were to go down and this one were to stay available, if this one here were to go down, I might not notice the PDC emulator issues for a while. Now that's a role that I probably would want to get back pretty quickly though. Some of these others I could live without for a good while. But the PDC emulator role, since it controls time throughout my entire forest, I want to make sure that it has some availability there. Also, by the way, I didn't mention this earlier, but anytime you edit group policy, by default, a group policy object editor will connect to the PDC emulator here. So regardless of which domain controller you're working physically on, which console you're at, even if you're on another domain controller, it's actually connecting to the PDC emulator. Also with the RID master, I've got 500 relative IDs to use before I'll start to miss the RID master. So in a small environment of only a couple dozen people, I'll probably never create that many accounts. And likewise with the infrastructure master, the real issue there is with cross-domain references in group memberships. And if I don't have any members in a group membership that are from other domains, then I really don't care about the infrastructure master because I'm never going to be using it anyway. Now, it's mostly my recommendation to split up the forest and the domain roles here between these two domain controllers. Microsoft does not necessarily say that you have to do that. I just think it's a good practice. In many cases, Microsoft will say, just leave all the roles on a single domain controller, and then with your other domain controller, just make that a standby operations master, so that if you know that you got to bring this one down for maintenance, you can transfer the roles all over to this one. For example, you'll see that in another scenario, such as this one, where I might have a little bit of a larger structure and I've got more domain controllers in play here. With that, what I would do is to split this up a little bit differently. For example, on this one, notice that I've split up the RID master role from the PDC emulator role. In the previous example, I had both the RID and the PDC emulator on the same server. Well, why might I want to do that? In many organizations, I wouldn't, unless I've got a lot of users coming in and out, and I'm creating a lot of new user accounts frequently, as is the case, perhaps, if you've got something like a university, and every semester you're enrolling and creating user accounts for thousands of users at a time. Well, in that instance, the RID master is going to be issuing, blocks of 500 RIDs pretty frequently while we're in that phase where we're creating a lot of different user accounts. And since the PDC emulator is the other busy role that could happen in an organization, I would split up these two busy roles on different domain controllers. Now the other thing we would want to do with that then is to have a standby master. And the standby master is not a bad idea, whether it's a small organization or a large organization. But we'll have a standby master that doesn't currently have any fsmo roles, but it is a functioning domain controller. Its purpose is, if I want to bring this server down for maintenance, or if it goes down unexpectedly, either way, I can transfer these roles to this standby master and either leave them there or transfer them back once this server comes back up again. And I can do, of course, the same with these roles, transfer them down there and back as necessary. You should make these all ring partners, however, so the PDC and infrastructure master should be direct ring partners with the standby master, and the schema domain naming and RID master over here should also be direct ring partners with the standby master. Now, when I talk about ring partners, what I mean is the replication topology, which we'll address in a future nugget here. But in brief, what happens is initially all domain controllers follow a ring topology, so that they go just like I show you right here around in a ring, both directions here. So what we'd have here then is a little bit of a convenience and a little bit better performance, so that if this server were to go down for maintenance or whatever, and I were to transfer these roles over to this standby master, then it would only require one replication cycle, which usually is going to be 5 minutes, to this other domain controller before it knows that this standby master now has the PDC and infrastructure master roles. And we're going to have that in a ring topology like this. Now, one thing I would not want to do is to put the standby master off in some remote campus where we're connected by a 56K WAN link and it only replicates every night at 3 a.m. because that's not going to be up to date enough. That's why I want these to be in the same site, in the same location, where they can get frequent updates to one another. Now finally notice here that, and let me get rid of this last little mark here, notice that I've taken the infrastructure master here and I've separated it from a global catalog server. You do not want the infrastructure master to be on a global catalog server. And why is that? Well, that has to do with how it gets updated information. Let's talk about that a little bit more here. Have you ever read a technical document that kind of baffles you? I mean, you look at a paragraph and you read through it, and it doesn't seem to make any sense, so you read through it again. And it still doesn't make any sense. Then you read through it a third time, and then now you've got more questions than answers, and pretty soon you start getting frustrated, and you feel kind of dumb because you think, boy, this was written in such a way that we're supposed to understand it, and I can't understand it. I have to tell you, there's probably nothing that's more true of than any of the many descriptions of the infrastructure master that I've seen in Microsoft documentation and other third-party documentation. I don't think I've ever read a real description of what it is. And if you talk to other trainers and other people in the IT world, you mention the infrastructure master, and they're kind of like, oh yeah, I know what that is, I know what it does. And yet nobody can explain it. So what's that about? So let's go ahead and take a look at what the infrastructure master does, and I hope to break some ground here, honestly, and give you what I hope to be the best and most accurate description of what the infrastructure master actually does, so that the light bulb goes on, because it is complicated, to be quite frank with you. Now let's go ahead and take a look at how the infrastructure master works. Now the first thing to understand is a quick review of the global catalog, because that has real significance in where you place the infrastructure master. Now, first of all, remember that the global catalog, its contents, all of its information is actually stored in the ntds.dit file. And so I'll just draw a little box out here. This represents the ntds.dit file on this particular domain controller. Now, this infrastructure master also has an ntds.dit file, because the infrastructure master appears on a domain controller, and all fsmo roles only appear on domain controllers. However, this ntds.dit file that this infrastructure master has is not going to have the same contents in all respects as this ntds.dit file. Why? Because it's not a global catalog. So this ntds.dit file, tds.dit file, is only going to have contents from its own domain, whereas this domain controller is going to have contents from other domains in the forest, because it's a global catalog. Remember, it contains all objects from all domains in the forest. Whereas this one, since it's not a global catalog, will only contain objects from its own domain. Now, the first thing to understand is to quickly review the global catalog. Remember, the global catalog contains all objects in the entire forest, which in this case consists of two separate domains. And because it contains all objects, the global catalog here knows about this Smith user account, because that's obviously an object. Even though it's another domain, since it contains all objects in all domains in the forest, it's going to have that. And this yellow box here represents the ntds.dit file for this domain controller. Now, it's got the Smith account in this ntds.dit file because it's a global catalog server. Again, it doesn't have everything about that Smith account, but it has the distinguished name and it has the SID. Now, why do these other domain controllers have that as well if they're not global catalog servers? Because what I've done here is I've taken this Smith user account from one domain and I've placed it inside of this security group in cbtnuggets.com. Well, this domain controller and this domain controller have ntds.dit files that contains all of the contents and all of the attributes of its own domain. So, of course, these domain controllers are going to have the operations security group in their ntds.dit. And the reason why they have the Smith account identified in that is because that, of course, is a member in that operations group. Now then, here's where things start to get tricky. If this username Smith, let's say this is a person that's a woman that's gotten married or something, and she decided to change her name, so she changes her name from Smith to Jones. This is where the infrastructure master comes in handy and where we have to have it. You see, she's changed her name to Jones over here. And of course, these domain controllers are going to be able to reflect that. They will also change that on their own to Jones. So whichever domain controller gets that change, wherever the administrator makes the change, of course, 5 minutes later, it's going to replicate that change to this domain controller, and we've got convergence between these domain controllers. However, over on this side of things, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to eventually get that way as well, but it uses a little bit different mechanism. You see, the infrastructure master peeks inside of this operations group, and it has, of course, that group in its own ntds.dit file, and it sees that I've got Smith correlating with this SID over on this domain controller. Now, what I want to do as the infrastructure master is I want to check with the global catalog server to see what it's got. Well, remember, the global catalog server will receive all objects throughout the entire forest. So sometime in replication, it's receiving also from these domain controllers over here, actually from this one, this global catalog server, that I have got a change to this person's last name. So this global catalog server in its ntds.dit file will change that name from Smith to Jones. Now, when the infrastructure master checks out the membership of this operations group and it says, I've got Smith, and it looks at the global catalog, and the global catalog server says, well, that's not what I've got Jones. Now the infrastructure master knows, and it says, hey, that must be an update. So I'm going to change that to Jones here on my own directory database. So we'll change it to Jones here. And as long as I've noticed that there's a change to be notified of, then I'm going to notify my other domain controllers, and it notifies its ring partner here, this other domain controller, that there is a change to that group membership in the operations group membership. So then this domain controller will also change its name to Jones. Now, the reason why this works well is because the infrastructure master and the global catalog server are on different domain controllers. This gets really messy really fast if you have the global catalog server and the infrastructure master on the same domain controller like I've got over here. And let me clean up a little bit and show us that scenario. Now here's where things are going to get tricky, because you see here I've got the infrastructure master and the global catalog on the same server. Now in NuggetsLab.com I've got the security group of marketing, and I've got a user from another domain in my same forest, Adams, with this SID over here from CBT Nuggets as a member of this marketing security group. Now let's say that Mr. Adams is not performing well and we decide that, oh, he's got to go, so we're going to fire him. And instead we'll replace him with another user, and that user's name is Logan. Now, as a common administrative practice, when you get rid of a user, you don't usually delete the account if you have a replacement for that user. That way, you don't have to re-permission all of the permissions that they have for printers and file shares and that kind of thing. So we just rename the account with this person's replacement, which happens to be a user named Logan. Now recall that all these domain controllers are peer domain controllers, regardless of whether they're infrastructure or global catalog and all that stuff. For their own domain, they have all the objects and all the attributes for their own domain. So this is going to get replicated just fine within its own domain. The problem comes in the fact that over here I've got the global catalog and the infrastructure master on the same server. You see, what's going to happen is, once this gets updated to Logan over here, then my global catalog is going to update this copy of the global catalog, and it's going to say, oh, we've changed that to Logan, fine. So it changes the name of the attribute here, or name of the object, to Logan with the same SID. The next thing that happens is the infrastructure master has to look for an update. It's minding its own business, it looks at its watch and it says, hey, looks like it's time for an update. I need to see if there are any changes to this marketing security group. So it looks inside of this marketing security group, it sees the SID that's in that marketing security group belonging to a user, and it says, who is that? It says, oh, I've got in my ntds.dit file that user account is Logan. That's what the infrastructure master sees. Then it says to the global catalog, what do you have in your ntds.dit file? Well, I also have Logan. Well, big duh, right, because they're both looking at the same ntds.dit file. Therefore, the infrastructure master does not realize that this has been a recent update. This is a classic example of the right hand not knowing what the left hand is doing. Now, since it doesn't see that this is updated or new information, then it never notifies this domain controller over here, and a replicated change is never made to this domain controller, so it will always have outdated information. And that's exactly why you can't have the infrastructure master and the global catalog on the same server, because it will never see updates. Now let me point out one other thing with the global catalog issue here after having cleaned up a bit here. If all of your domain controllers are also global catalogs, then this issue of having an infrastructure master on the same server as the global catalog server doesn't make any difference, because since it's a global catalog, it's also gotten the update from the global catalog over here about the update to the name Logan in the case that I just mentioned. So in that case, it'd be a moot point. It would also be a moot point if I only had one domain controller and it was the global catalog and infrastructure master, because again, its ntds.dit file would be updated and it doesn't have to update anybody else with the proper information. Now, I'm going to talk to you shortly about how to transfer an operations master role to a different domain controller. The first thing you have to understand, though, is where your existing fsmos are. I mean, you might not have built this network. You might be getting a new job, and you don't know what the previous admin did. He might have scattered the fsmo roles hither and yon, and you're not sure where they are. So what you can do to find out is to go to the Start menu, Administrative Tools, and go to Active Directory Users and Computers to find a few of these. And a couple of the other ones you'll have to find in another location. But just go into this and right-click on the domain, and then choose Operations Masters, and that gives you 3 of the Operations Masters. One is on the RID, the relative ID, is on DC Nugget 1. PDC Emulator, again, DC Nugget 1, and all these are going to be on DC Nugget 1. There, again, the Infrastructure Master is on DC Nugget 1. So that's how we can find those 3 out through the GUI. Now, one of the other operations master role that we can find is the domain naming master, and for that one, we'll simply go to Active Directory Domains and Trusts, and again, don't right-click on one of these domains. What we want to do is to right-click up here on Active Directory Domains and Trusts, then choose Operations Master. It tells us that DC Nugget 1 is the domain naming operations master. And then to locate the schema master role, we can just go to an MMC console, and I just need to add in the schema add-in here, and you've seen me do that in a previous nugget, so I'm going to quickly, if I click on the right things here, quickly go click on Add Remove Snap-in. Having done that, we're going to go ahead and add the Active Directory schema, and I'll close all of this up. And now if I go to the Active Directory schema here, and right-click on the Active Directory schema item right there, it says Operations Master. Who is it? Again, DC Nugget 1. So that's how we can find out all of that information. Now, in addition to identifying fsmos from the GUI, you can also do it from the command line. There's several tools you can use for this. I'm just going to use, but let's use 3 of them. Dump, and then an fsmos, followed by the name of the server, DC Nugget 1 in this case, and that dumps out all of the roles that are being held by this server. Now, this will only identify the roles on the name of the server that you specify up here. If I didn't have any roles being held, then it wouldn't really give me any of these things. But here's where it says I've got 5 roles that it knows about on this server after it's connected to this server. It's got the schema master, the domain naming master, the PDC emulator, RID master, and infrastructure master, all on this same server. Another tool I could use to identify specific roles on a specific server would be dsquery, and then a space, and then the word server. That doesn't represent a variable. You type in the literal word server, and then HASFSMO for has fsmo, and press enter, and it doesn't do anything for you. And that's because you actually have to specify which role it is you're looking for, and I forgot to type that in. So let's say I wanted to find, the PDC emulator. Press enter there. It identifies the PDC emulator for me as DC Nugget 1. Do that again. I want to find out which one is the schema, SCHEMA, and it identifies that one as well for me. So you have to do it this way if you want to find just one at a time using dsquery. Now, another tool that I really like for a lot of diagnostic and troubleshooting issues with Active Directory is dcdiag, and here I'm going to be able to use it to identify all of the roles in a single shot here, regardless of which server those roles are hosted on. So that's why I like dcdiag, because the other tools that I showed you, you have to specify which server you're looking at, and if you already know which server to look at for the role, then why do you really need to look it up, right? Well, this one will kind of give me in a shotgun blast all of the roles, even if I don't know, and even if I don't have any idea which actual domain controller any of the roles are on. So, /test : knows of role holders. I don't know why Microsoft had to make this so long. Couldn't they just had us type in fsmo at the end of this? Anyway, knows of role holders /v, and we see then that we have all of the roles identified here. The schema, the domain naming master, the PDC emulator, the RID manager, or RID master, and infrastructure master. By the way, I say RID manager because Microsoft calls it the RID manager in some places and RID master in others. If you go down here and we do this again, you saw me do this in an earlier portion of this nugget, but this tool can also give you specific information about some of those roles. For example, if I do RID manager here in this command line and press enter, then I get specific information about the RID pools, which we saw from a previous point in time in this nugget. Well, now let's talk about how we're actually going to transfer a role. So let's say that, for example, DC Nugget 2 is a domain controller. It's actually in another domain, but I want to transfer one of the Forest fsmo roles over to DC Nugget 2. Currently, they're all on DC Nugget 1, as we've seen. Well, a couple of ways of doing that. Number one, I could go to Administrative Tools and go to Active Directory Domains and Trusts where I was earlier. And this time, I want to connect to a specific domain controller instead of going directly to Operations Master like that. because all this would allow me to do is to transfer the role from this server to this server. They look kind of the same. That's because they are. I can't transfer it to itself. So what I have to do is to go back up here and connect to a specific domain controller, and I want to enter in the domain here first. It's going to be the domain controller in CBT Nuggets, and it's DC Nugget 2. And then I'll just click OK. Now I'm connected to DC Nugget 2, and I can now go to Operations Master. Now it allows me to transfer from this DC Nugget 1 to DC Nugget 2. I can click on Change. And am I sure I want to transfer the Operations Master role to a different computer? Yes. And it was able to do so successfully. And so now that particular role, the Domain Naming Operations Master, is on DC Nugget 2. Real simple to do from the interface. And you would do pretty much the same exact thing from Active Directory users and computers. You'd again right-click on the domain for that case, and just choose the Operations Master item, and then just transfer it just the way I'd done after you have successfully connected to the server to which you want to transfer that role. Now, if I want to transfer the role back, then I can also use a command line called ntdsutil. Just type in ntdsutil. And then what we want to do here is to go to the roles portion of the functionality for ntdsutil. In the fsmo maintenance item, I need to connect to the server that I want to transfer the role to. So I'll do connect connections. And I'll just type in CONN. You can abbreviate that. The server connection I want to make a connection to is connect to server DC Nugget 1. Press enter. I've connected to that server now. Now that I've made the connection on server connections prompt here, I can quit that prompt and go back to fsmo maintenance. Once I'm at the fsmo maintenance, now all I have to do is to transfer that role. So I'll just transfer, and I don't have to type the whole thing, but domain naming master is what I'm getting at here. So I can just type in the first few characters of all of those roles, and then it asks me if I'm sure I want to transfer it to DC Nugget 1. Yes, I do, and then it was able to successfully transfer it. And we see that here because DC Nugget 1 knows about 5 roles, and now we see that the domain naming master role is reset back to DC Nugget 1. Now, if you want to know about that and many of the other fsmo role items that you can do, or any of the other NTDS utility items you can just do a question mark at any of these prompts, and it shows you all the stuff you can do. For example, when I transferred the domain naming master role, I just typed in tran, and then DOM, and NAM, and then MAS. You can just abbreviate the first portions of this so that it's unique compared to all of these other commands, and it'll know which one you're trying to get to, and it'll just do the whole thing for you then. I could have typed the whole thing in, but I'm just lazy, that's all. And also, I could have continued to use the GUI to transfer the role back using Active Directory Domains and Trusts. I could have used that to transfer back to DC Nugget 1. I just wanted you to see that you can do it from both a GUI and from the command line, and from the command line you'll use ntdsutil. Then when you're done with ntdsutil, you just quit until you get back out, and then you're done, and then we'll just exit, and now our roles are where we want them to be. Now, what we just showed you there was a graceful transfer of the Operation Master roles, where it connects to and contacts the original holder of that role, and it says, hey, I'm going to go ahead and take this role, okay? And then the domain controller says, okay, I'm going to go ahead and give it to you. Have a nice day. Now, sometimes you're not going to have such a nice day. And a domain controller that has a critical role might be down, it might have blown up, someone might have spilled a Coke on it, and you don't think it's ever going to come back to life. So if that's the case, you're going to have to take an Operations Master role, and you're going to have to seize that role, because there's no way to gracefully transfer it from the server that has gone down hard. Now, in order to be able to do that, you're going to have to use ntdsutil. You cannot use the GUI for this function. So again, you go to ntdsutil, and we'll go again to our roles, and then we're going to go ahead and connect to a server. So in this case, I'm going to connect back to server DC Nugget 3, to server DC Nugget 3, and we are connected now to that server. Then I'll just go ahead and quit that, and now I can go ahead and do my fsmo maintenance. And again, if you do a question mark, it kind of helps if you just look at all the different things you want to do. Let's say in this particular case, for example, that DC Nugget 1 had a problem with one of these roles. Let's just say it was the Schema Master. So we're going to go ahead and seize the Schema Master. So we'll seize, if I can type, seize Schema Master. Press enter. Are you sure you want to seize that role? You want to seize that role, and we would go ahead and then say yes. No, in my case, I'm not going to actually go through with this, but it's real easy. Just click yes, and it does it. The reason why I'm not going to do it is because the DC Nugget 1 server is the Schema Master right at this point, and it is online. In fact, you're looking at it. So I don't want to seize the role if the server is up. That's usually not a good practice. So anytime the server is down, unavailable to transfer gracefully, that's when you're going to seize it. Now, you also have to keep in mind that there's some roles that once you've seized them, you should never allow the original one to come back up. And those 3 roles are the RID Master, the schema master, and the domain naming master. You never want those three roles to come back up, because if they do, then what could happen is, let's say that the original domain naming master did not have any knowledge of a domain called cbtnuggets.com. Well, this domain naming master goes down, so I seize the role on a different server. Now, the different server will go ahead and allow the creation of a cbtnuggets.com. So it has record of cbtnuggets.com, and it will not allow someone to create another quote-unquote domain called cbtnuggets.com because it says, hey, we've already got that. However, if I bring this server back up and it tries to create another server or another domain called cbtnuggets.com, it doesn't have any way of knowing that that's been created in the past because I had that role on a different server. Now I have two domain naming masters, and I could really get into a situation there because I could accidentally create the same domain twice. Similar thing with the RID master. It might have given out a pool with the replacement RID master, and when this one comes back up, it might give out the same pool of numbers and again give us a problem there. And then finally with a schema, there might be changes on the schema master that has seized that role that this schema master would not have realized when it comes back up. And again, if I have two schema masters online and they both have different copies of the schema, then I could really get some serious corruption within Active Directory. Now that after I've cleared everything out, let me just make a quick footnote to this as well. If we have two domain controllers, in this case DCNugget1 and DCNugget3, and DCNugget3 has some fsmo roles, or even all of the fsmo roles, if I decide I don't need DCNugget3 anymore and I run dcpromo to decommission it and remove Active Directory from that server, any fsmo roles that it has, it will seek out another domain controller and transfer those roles to that other domain controller. So it will do it automatically, but I strongly recommend that you do it manually before you run dcpromo so you know exactly where those roles are going. Because otherwise it may potentially transfer them to a domain controller that would not be your desired domain controller. In this nugget, we talked about Operations Master, or what I usually call them is just fsmos. We saw that there are two forest roles. One of those is the schema, and the other one of those is the domain naming role for the forest. The other roles that we saw are the domain roles. That'd be the RID master, the PDC emulator, and the infrastructure master roles. One thing that's important about those that we saw is the placement of those specific roles, depending on the size of your organization, where your global catalogs are, and things of this nature. Then we took a look at how to transfer those roles if necessary. And if you want to do that, you can use the GUI, or you can use a command line. We also showed you, by the way, how to identify where those fsmo roles are. And then we talked about seizure of those roles as well. This is going to happen if one of your domain controllers that has one or more of those roles goes down unexpectedly or goes down hard and it blows up. Then you have to determine how to put that role on another server without the cooperation of the original fsmo role holder. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.